All right. Thanks for your patience, everybody. So we are live streaming on Facebook. We are recording this meeting. This will be posted on Councilwoman Sandoval's YouTube channel after the fact. There's also a bunch of other great Ask a Planner videos there that you can check out. And the slides that I'm going to be presenting will be made available to you. At the least I can send them out to this list of people that registered, because there's a lot of great links, info in there, as you'll see. But just to get going, I'm Naomi, so I am an aide for Councilwoman Sandoval, and I am also a planner. I went to school for planning, and that is what I do for the councilman. I focus on land use, development, and planning. And this Ask a Planner series is something that Councilman Sandoval likes to host as a more informal, casual way to talk with constituents, with you all, about various topics in planning, whether it's parks, whether it's ADUs, even water conservation, Denver sustainability plans, things like that. So we usually bring in a guest from a department, and I'll, sometimes I do a bit of a presentation, which I'll do today, but oftentimes we have a guest from another department and then spend most of the time for Q&A. So it's really meant to be a very casual, very approachable way for you to ask questions and interact with people in the city that you may not have access to normally. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and going through a presentation here. We may be joined by a planner from the planning department, Josh Palmeri, to talk about another project about ADUs after I talk about their current rules and regulations, and a really exciting project that's happening there. So while I'm presenting, feel free to put questions in the chat. So I'm happy to answer anything that's a clarifying question, or if I'm starting to use planner speak and you're like, Naomi, hold on, like you used an acronym, I don't know what you're talking about, please put that in the chat. I will do my best to pause and answer that and clarify it. But other than that, we'll save the Q&A till the Q&A portion at the end, at which point, since we're kind of a smaller group today, well, we can just go ahead and you can raise your hand, or you can just unmute yourself to ask a question, or put the question in the chat and I will just bring them up at the end and kind of moderate that discussion. If you're on Facebook watching, feel free to put questions, comments, or anything in Facebook. We'll also keep an eye on that and incorporate the questions in there. And if I know there's someone that is attending with a phone. So we'll also talk about how you can mute or unmute yourself via phone, and participate in that later as well when we get to the Q&A portion. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Awesome. So hopefully everybody can see that. So as I said, welcome. We'll do a short presentation. Well, it's actually going to be a little bit of a longer presentation than I normally give, because this is a technical heavy topic. So I'm going to walk us through the rules and the regulations around ADUs. And again, these will be links. I know this is a lot of information to absorb at once. So there'll be links in this document that we'll send out later. So you can use this presentation as a resource. And after that, we'll have Josh presenting about the ADU project. So I'm going to talk about what ADUs are, what the rules are for designing an ADU in the zoning code, and then there's also rules about what you can use an ADU for. And all this is hopefully to help you get both a sense of what ADUs actually are and how they're regulated in Denver, and if you are interested yourself in building one, sort of what those first steps are and things to think about as you move forward with that. So what are ADUs? They are often known by other less technical names, such as granny flats, casitas, carriage houses, cottages. But in Denver, they're very specific. ADU stands for accessory dwelling unit, and it means an extra smaller dwelling unit in addition to the primary house on a single unit property. So it's kind of long, but the key word is really accessory. This is a smaller living unit that is accessory to a single unit home. So there's actually two forms. A lot of times we think about the detached, which is really that casita, that other little building in the back. But there's also an attached form of ADUs that is allowed in Denver. I'm going to show you what those look like. But for most of this presentation, we're really talking about, in the rest of the presentation, we're talking about the detached form, because that's generally what people are more interested in. So this is the detached ADU. As you can see, it's the smaller unit that sits at the back of the property. But this is an attached ADU, which can also be, it looks more like an addition. It doesn't have to even be new built. It could be just a part of your existing building that you separate out into its own separate dwelling unit. It has its own entrance. It has everything you need to live, showers, food preparation, stuff like that. It could also be located in a basement. A lot of homes here in Denver have really nice big basements. And so that's a pretty common, even historically, situation to see as well, as a separate unit that is actually in the basement of a home. Here's an example. This house, this little bungalow, has actually an ADU in the basement. It's really hard to see from the street. This is an example of kind of the diversity of what an accessory dwelling unit can actually look like. So I do want to highlight that under the current rules, again, an accessory dwelling unit can only be accessory to a single unit dwelling. So that means if you've got a single unit dwelling, one house on a piece of property, yes, you can build an ADU if you have all these, if you have the zoning for it, etc. If, however, you, for example, have you live in one side of a duplex, you own that one side of it. Unfortunately, at this point, an ADU is not allowed, as that it only is allowed if you have a single unit home on that property. So if you do live in a duplex, you cannot build an ADU at this time. I also want to point out that ADUs are very different from how the zoning code, for example, treats duplexes. They're not a duplex unit, they're not an apartment, and they're not commercial. And the zoning and allowance for an ADU doesn't open up the possibility of any of those other things. It's a very specific, very constrained definition. So currently ADUs are allowed in about 30% of the city. They're already allowed in areas that allow 2 or more units, or commercial areas, and they're allowed in single unit areas. So those single unit areas are zones that have a 1 at the end. Councilwoman Sandoval has sponsored a number of larger neighborhood-wide rezonings to alleviate the burden of individual property owners having to rezone to get that 1 if they don't currently have the 1. And to clarify, the only difference between a single unit zone that doesn't have the 1, USUB, for example, on here, and USUB 1 is that ability to build an ADU. That doesn't change anything else about the type of main house you can build or anything else about the zoning. It just is the ability to build an ADU in addition. So now I'm going to start diving into the ADU rules and building standards. So as I mentioned, this is probably going to get pretty technical. So feel free, I've got the chat open in case anybody wants to post in there and ask clarifying questions. We're going to dive into the zoning code. So one of the reasons that we put this presentation together is that there's a lot to know about building an ADU before you go into it. So you as a homeowner, hopefully this information will help you decide if an ADU, a detached ADU specifically, is actually the right choice for you and your property. It'll help you make informed decisions, and hopefully this presentation will also help you get ahead of any surprises that may happen. So such as, realizing that, oh my gosh, I need to actually, or I have too many structures on my property, or we'll see as we get forward. There's a lot of catches that people can run into. Also, who should know this information is any contractor, architect, builder that you work with to build an ADU. I would definitely suggest that if you're considering building an ADU, that you find a contractor that has experience specifically with ADUs in Denver, not just someone who may be very good at building garages or what we call other accessory structures. ADUs are very specific, and there are, again, a lot of rules around them. We don't want you to get hung up by unexpected surprises of how complicated they actually are. And so choosing an architect or contractor who has experience with ADUs is one of the best ways to have a smooth experience. So I'm going to show you where you can find the information that I'm about to present. So again, this will all be in this document linked. These are live links, so you'll be able to use this as a resource. But what I suggest, first of all, you got to find the zone district that your property is in. There's this very handy interactive map at this link. When you go to it, you put in your property up here. I just have a very random property, I think is a school, just for an example here. And it'll look up your address and you will find your zoning. So it'll mention it on this little pop-up here. After that, here's a quick explanation of what those words mean. So all our zones are kind of 3 chunks separated by dashes. The first letter in this series is always going to refer to the largest overall context of what this zone means. So a U is really common in most of District 1. Your zone district, when you look it up, will probably start with a U. It means urban, and it's a very broad description of what Denver's sort of original inner ring suburbs were, these historic suburbs. There are a lot of single units there, but they're kind of dense, those historic neighborhoods there. The next set of letters starts getting a little more specific. So SU, as you can imagine, stands for single unit, which means this zone district has mainly single unit standalone homes, and that's generally all that you could build new in that district. And then the last set of letters actually refer to average and minimum lot sizes, I should say more minimum lot sizes for that zone district. So if you have a B at the very end, that means your zone district has a minimum lot size of 4,500 square feet, C, 5,500 square feet, etc. And then again, at the very end, that 1, if you have the 1, it allows an ADU. So once you've found what your zone district is, you can go to the zoning code and look at the chapter that specifically talks about your zone district. So I'd say go and these links here are by article, just the chapters in the zoning code. You just want to look at the chapter that's for your overall context. So again, here's urban. This is generally what everyone on this call would probably be clicking on. And that's going to open up a PDF. And you're going to be able to ignore 90% of this very long PDF. What you're going to want to jump to, if you want to know about the building form standards for accessory dwelling units, is to jump down to section 534. And this set of pages is what I'm going to walk you through right now. And I know it's pretty impossible to see, very tiny on this screen, but that's why that's where you can find all the information I'm about to show you. So just to back up a little bit about what this whole zoning code thing does and looks like, Denver has a form-based code, but also talks a bit about uses. So in other words, the zoning code tells you what shape generally a building can take, but also a little bit about what happens inside it. It's like what you can use it for. So for example, a detached accessory dwelling unit is a form type. It's a type of constraint of building that you can build, but there's also some restrictions to how that can be used. So for example, an accessory dwelling unit use means someone can legally live in it. It is a dwelling unit. That also means that it has to be, it kicks in, many provisions for it being built up to code for a dwelling unit. So there's zoning code, there's building code, all of that kind of converges in here, but I'm going to just walk you through the zoning code because that's what I'm most familiar with and is sort of the place to start when thinking about designing your ADU. So I'm going to show you 5 of the major form standards that would impact how an ADU on your property might look, where it's sited, how tall it can be, etc. So first of all, if you're thinking about building an ADU, the first thing to look at is what is the actual size of your property and if you can actually build a detached ADU. Under our current standards, you actually have to make sure your lot is big enough. So if you remember, that last letter in your zone district refers to a minimum lot size. So for example, if you're in a USUC, or C1, sorry, zone district, 1, it allows ADUs. USUC is very common throughout a lot of District 1. That means you have a minimum lot size of 5,500 square feet. That's also the minimum. You have to have at least that amount of property to build a detached ADU. So if your lot just happens to be smaller than that, which is actually a very common case, because again, zone districts are kind of a broad brush, you can still have an ADU, it just can't be a detached one. You have the option to do an attached ADU. So one in your basement, one that looks like an addition, etc. But you actually can't build that separate unit in the back. So that's very important, first of all. Secondly, we're going to talk about this concept called the bulk plane. So the bulk plane I like to describe as an imaginary glass box that's what your building, your structure, whatever you're building has to fit inside. It's constrained by this kind of imaginary dimensions here. So we'll dive into it a little bit. There's an example. So imaginary glass box, little hypothetical blue structure that fits inside of it. The bulk plane has several main components. So for example, it's really this shearing at the side. So this kind of 45-degree angle that comes up. You come up from the property lines and then goes in at a 45-degree angle. Your building has to fit inside of that. So the start of that slope is a very important measurement. And again, this is all in this table. So if you open it up and kind of dive into it, it'll probably make a little more sense than this brief overview. But it's just something that is super important. So another this is a component of the bulk plane, but is also, stands alone in the sense that you have a height cap for an accessory dwelling unit. So that height cap is 24 feet maximum. So the highest point of that structure, that ADU you're building, is 24 feet. Also, we have a stories maximum. So your ADU can only be 1.5 stories. And what the heck does that mean? So a half story in the zoning code, it's not like a height measurement. It's actually the area of a story compared to the area of the story below it measurement. So I think this illustration is hopefully a good descriptor of it, but it really means a half story is a story where the whole area of that story is no greater than 75% of the floor below it. And the way that they measure what that area is actually this minimum floor to ceiling distance of 6 feet. So that half story is also something that kind of trips people up sometimes. It can be a bit difficult to design an ADU if you're doing a 2-story ADU, to figure out how you make that second story small enough to really be a half story compared to the area below it. And getting close to the end, most important is also to think about setbacks. So that's how you're building your ADU can't be placed directly on your property line. You should make sure that on your property you have enough room to have at least 5 feet from your neighboring property line, 5 feet from the rear of your property to where it's positioned. And then big thing, lastly, is that ADUs, since they're meant to be accessory, they're meant to be smaller than what could be built as a main house. There are footprint and size maximums for an ADU. That again is based on how big your actual property is. It's not so much your zoning, it's how big your actual property is. So if you have a lot that is less than 6,000 square feet, the biggest footprint of an ADU that you could build is 650 square feet. And then that goes up all the way until you've got a quite large lot, greater than 7,000 square feet. You could build an ADU of up to 1,000 square feet. There's also something to keep in mind, which is that this applies to any structure you build on your property, but there's actually a maximum coverage for any property. And this has to do with having permeable surface for rainwater to come into. So there's some details about that. But again, if you're interested in that, I would suggest diving a little bit more into the code, or we can talk about it more later in the Q&A section. So in summary, make sure when you look at your document, you find your zone district, you find the page in the zoning code, look at the lot height, lot size, look at the height that's allowed in the bulk plane, look at the setbacks, and look at how big you could actually build your ADU. Now, if there is something truly unique and different about your property, It could be something just unusual about, for example, the terrain, something that makes these rules very difficult to work with. There is a process for asking for a variance. That is through the Board of Adjustments. It's really meant for minor exceptions, and you have to prove you have a hardship that's not either your fault or just not something that's just, well, I want to build a bigger ADU, so I should be allowed to. There's very strict standards. So proceed with caution if you need a variance, but know that that is an option. So a couple of other considerations when you're thinking about building an ADU is, do you have any other unpermitted structures on your property? So, maybe a shed or a garage or really anything that was built and there's no permit records of it being built. And it doesn't matter, unfortunately, if it was an owner, 3 owners before you, but those kind of things will likely be caught when you go and try to get your permit for your ADU. And it's very likely that you'll be asked to retroactively get your permits for anything that was built without permits before you get your permission to build your ADU. So keep that in mind. Also, you as a homeowner are not able to pull permits to work on your own ADU. I know there are abilities to kind of be your own general contractor, or actually do work on your own house. That does not apply to an accessory dwelling unit. So you will need to actually hire contractors, licensed contractors, to do that work. And then lastly, sometimes when there is a large amount of new work being done on a property, there's other requirements that kick in to, for example, upgrade if you really poor quality sidewalks in front of your house. Sidewalks are in Denver the responsibility of the homeowner. You may be required to do those improvements at the same time. Sometimes there's issues with alleys being too narrow, and you may be asked to, site your ADU differently. Just some things to be aware of. These can happen. All right, I'm trying to move through this a little more quickly because I know we're running through time and this is a bit of a longer presentation. But after building an ADU, what can you do with this? This is kind of, what are those limitations about using an ADU that I was mentioning? These rules can be found, again, if you want to dive into the zoning code, in Article 11. The main thing that you should know is that you can never sell off your ADU. It has to remain accessory to something. If it's subdivided and sold off, it's not accessory to something, it's its own standalone dwelling unit. So you can't sell off the ADU, the land under it. Another very important thing is if you are in a single unit district and you want to build an ADU, you have to live on the property. You can live in the ADU or in the main house, but you do have to live on that property to technically have an accessory dwelling unit. Another big question we get is how ADUs and short-term rentals interact. So short-term rentals rules are regulated by excise and license versus accessory dwelling units, zoning, permits, things like that. That's on the planning department side. So these can be tricky because it is the intersection of 2 very different departments. But to sum it up, if you have an ADU, yes, you can short-term rent your ADU. You do have to live on the property because short-term rental rules say that that has to be your primary residence to have a short-term rental anywhere on your property. You do need to get a license, but yes, you can short-term rent your ADU if you live on the property. However, you cannot live in your ADU and short-term rent the main house. That's because short-term rental is really considered more of a hotel type of activity. And if you're in a residential area, the idea is that the main activity on your property is that it is residential. It's not a hotel. So if the main use in the main house on your property is being used as a hotel, that's violating that. So it's kind of that's a simplification, but that's why you cannot rent out short-term the main house. You can long-term rent it, but not short-term rent it. And in single unit districts, you are not able to rent out both the ADU and the main house. Like I said on the previous slide, if you're in a single unit district, you have to live on the property somewhere. It can't just be a rental. All right, I'm going to fly through these next pages. This is really meant, again, more as links. So if you do want to start going down this road of actually getting permits. There's several types of permits you'll need. There's a project page that's linked here in a project kind of document that should help as a guide to the steps that you're going to start needing to submit if you're thinking about doing an ADU. And this is just a quick preview of what that document looks like. For example, there's some checklists and things like that. So that's in here, it's more as a resource. And I'm done. Thank you so much for bearing with me for that. I'm going to turn it over to Josh. I have some slides here in the deck, and Josh, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. I do see a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to answer one really fast, but otherwise, Josh, feel free to go ahead and let me know how I can advance the slides for you.
Sure, thanks everybody. Hi, nice to meet you guys. Josh Palmeri, Senior City Planner.
Oh,
CPD.
Oh, sorry, I had my sound turned off. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Are we good? Yeah, so I'm the project manager for the ADUs in Denver project. I'll just quickly go through what we're tackling in this project and hopefully get to your questions. So the ADUs in Denver project just kicked off this month, I guess, the beginning of the month, with our advisory committee. And currently we are tasked with directly implementing this Blueprint Denver recommendation, which is land use recommendation number 5, which says to remove barriers to ADU construction and also create context sensitive form standards. And so, yeah, we can go to the next slide. What that really means for us is, well, to be clear, what this is not doing is we're not actually changing the zoning in any bits of the city. So we're not doing an amendment to parts of town that would allow an ADU where they're not currently allowed today. We do have that recommendation. That's recommendation number 4, which stands alongside this recommendation and Blueprint. But we've heard that, you know, a lot of parts of the city aren't quite ready to take on ADUs fully and allow them outright. So we are leaving that process up to individual property owners. They are allowed to come forward and rezone their property if they want to with this guidance. But we're also leaving it to some of our neighborhood planning processes, the NPI process, which you might have heard of, that's ongoing, and also individual council members, like Councilwoman Sandoval has done so previously. Next slide, please. So yeah, so this project is going to remove barriers to ADU construction. And we also want to make sure that they fit into different types of neighborhoods. So Naomi alluded to the idea of contexts within the city of Denver. We have like suburban neighborhoods, far edges of town that are different lot configurations, larger lot sizes. They typically don't have alleys. And currently our ADU rules are the exact same citywide. So we really need to look at closely how we can tailor them appropriately to these different contexts. And so the outcome will be revisions to the zoning code, which Naomi went over in great detail. All of those fun numbers and technical details we'll take a look at closely, what needs to change and what needs to be different in those different contexts. Let's see, next slide. And so, yeah, some of the barriers that we've heard about were exactly what was sort of presented earlier. Things like the size limitation. We want to know if 650 square feet is enough. Is it feasible to kind of build that size ADU? Is it habitable? Are we allowing enough for good outcomes? The height limitations, things like reusing of existing structures. We know that that's important to folks. The sustainable thing to do is to reuse an existing building, but zoning has quite a few barriers and sort of unforeseen hurdles that get in the way of allowing that good outcome, which we would like to see. And once again, you know, we don't have the appropriate zone districts in those suburban contexts or in other contexts throughout the city. Another snag is with that 1.5 story limitation that Naomi mentioned. We're often seeing people are building a larger sort of ground floor garage than they would rather, just in order to get the appropriate amount of square footage above. And so we're sort of forcing you into, you know, building larger than you would like to. And so we'd love to create some efficiencies there and hopefully potentially bring down the cost of actually constructing an ADU. Next slide here. And so, yeah, the last bit that we're charged with doing is figuring out that context piece. What should a suburban ADU look like? And so here you can see on the right, the map shows those neighborhood contexts. The urban mostly covers D1, it looks like. It's hard to see in this map, but it's the lightest blue. And so the contexts sort of fan out from there. So we do have urban smaller lots, typically having alleys, urban edge lots, or a mix of alley, no alleys, but typically smaller homes on medium-sized lots. And then the suburban context is much larger lots, typically without alleys. And so we really want to figure out what is appropriate for each of these districts, because right now those rules are the same. So that's what we're doing. It's going to be a year-long project. We should be wrapping up at the end of this year with our steering committee meetings and hopefully adopt new rules around accessory dwelling units come next spring. So be on the lookout for those, and you can find out more on our website, adusindenver.com, and our meetings are public and you may attend them. They happen every the first Thursday of every month. And so meeting number 2 is coming up in 2 weeks. That's all I have. So Naomi, want to open up for questions, I suppose?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Josh. And I'll mention that I'm on the advisory group for that. And as part of that, I'm incorporating a lot of the feedback that I've heard, from you all, from residents of District 1, and bringing that forward as well in that process. And we had a lot, Josh, we had a lot of people just watching the last meeting. I think we had like 45 observers. It was really great. So it seems like a very people are really interested in this. And maybe you could describe as an observer, if you're not on the advisory committee, like how can you participate at a meeting?
Yeah, definitely. We do open it up towards the end of the meetings for Q&A, for public comment, but we also have outlets on our website. You can sign up for our email updates. There's a comment form in there that you may submit to us as staff, as well as the committee. I forward those on, any concerns you might have. But yeah, I mean, you're always free to email me or anyone on the project team if you have a specific concern. My contact information is on that website as well.
Awesome. Would you mind typing you have adusindenver.com?
Yeah, it's pretty easy to remember.
That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind typing that into the chat, and I will post it on Facebook as well, so people can just click that. Awesome, thank you. All right, so we have some questions, and I turned off my screen share just so we can see each other. Feel free to turn your videos on if you want. Totally understand. If not, it is lunchtime. So I'm going to start with some questions that we got. Let's see, we'll start, Gabe, with your question about 5-foot setbacks. So why is there a 5-foot setback? I don't know, Josh, if you want to answer that one.
Sure, yeah. I think, 5 foot is typical for our larger lot sizes for the primary structure, for the most part. I mean, some of that comes from fire code. We do need separation. I think the minimum is 3 feet regardless. So in our smallest lots in the city, you are allowed to have a 3-foot setback, but the zoning context has a little bit more space in greater contexts. It's a lot about light, allowing light into your neighbor's yard. Folks don't get too excited about someone building right on their property. And so if you have 5 feet on either piece of property, that is a total of 10 foot of space to allow for light and air. It's also for the side setbacks, that is. For the rear setback, when you're building on an alley, it's actually controlled by DOTI. Transportation requires a appropriate amount of space for a vehicular turn to be able to pull into your garage, your unit. So if it's an ADU with a parking below, there needs to be appropriate space there for the vehicular maneuvers to happen on a 16-foot wide alley. And so it does in turn sort of widen the alley a bit, which is helpful.
Yeah. Do you want to ask any follow-up questions, Gabe? You can unmute yourself if you want. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just wondering because it seems like, you mentioned that you wanted to leave open space or sun space or whatever for the neighborhood, but like with these scrapes, they are built, 2-3 stories up sometimes, and that doesn't allow, the open space area too. So I was just wondering, what's the trade-off?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I guess the bulk plane is another one of those tools that Naomi described that really tries to get after that, allowing the sun in. So it's at a certain height, you can't build straight up all the way along the property line. But yeah, I mean, it's just kind of a carryover from our existing zoning standards. And so those setbacks have been in place, since what, 1954 was the
Yeah,
latest Denver's adoption.
I'd say it's a pretty common. Denver's not an exception in terms of if you compare like our zoning code to a lot of other city zoning codes, it's a pretty standard thing. But I think your question or your point about, main home, when there's a lot of scrapes of, kind of main existing homes, there's a huge difference most of the time in what is currently existing in our neighborhoods versus what you can build. And one reason that Councilman Sandoval really likes ADUs is that they can help, like when you build in, one of the reasons that you see scrapes, and it's one of the reasons, there's no silver bullet, but is that in Denver, there are smaller homes on properties that are very valuable. The improvements itself, the house itself, is actually not as valuable. So to a developer, for example, it is financially feasible to buy the land, scrape the house, build something 3 times as big, sell that for, over $1 million or so. But if the idea of an ADU is that you don't do anything with the front of with the main house, the front of the property. Not to say that a newly built home can't also build an ADU. It's not a super, super common thing, but I've seen them. There's a couple of houses, newly built houses near me that have ADUs as well. But really, it's a tool for existing homes to say, we've got now even more sort of value on the property. There's a newly built ADU. It makes it less lucrative for example, like a speculative developer to come and say, oh yeah, I'm just going to tear down everything that's on this property and build something brand new, because all of a sudden you've got a bit more value in the actual structures on the property. So again, it's not saying it's a silver bullet, but it is a kind of a side effect of ADUs in terms of how they interact with scrapes of the main house.
Thank you.
And it does depend. Oh, go ahead. You have a follow-up?
No, I was just saying thanks for the explanation. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it does depend a little bit on the zoning too. I mean, some of your districts, and single unit, I guess, is exclusively what we're talking about with the 5 foot. But sometimes, like near Tennyson, you might be closer to a mixed use or a Main Street zoning district there, where the setbacks are actually 0 because it is a higher intensity. And oftentimes, those zoning districts do abut residential districts, and so it appears to be different in a way, but typically in the middle of a suburban neighborhood, you should see at least a 5 foot setback.
All right, let's go on to, Maggie, thanks. You did bring up, I know I've seen you at those meetings, there's the equity and rezoning process going on. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but since we were talking about rezonings, because again, if you're not in a single unit district with that one at the end, you do have to ask for a rezoning to get the one. And the rezoning process is a process that is the same steps for anything you're trying to rezone, whether it's someone trying to rezone a huge commercial lot up to 30 stories in downtown, or if it's just an individual property owner asking to rezone to allow an ADU, the process is the same. And so Maggie did bring up that there's actually a city process as well that Councilman Sandoval is actually sitting on as a task force member to look at the equity in that rezoning process. So that is how that intersects with ADUs quite a bit, actually, because I think at the last meeting, something either 40% or more of the rezonings that have come through in 2021 were ADU rezoning requests. So individual homeowners asking to get rezoned to have that one at the end of their zone district and be able to build an ADU. You want to add anything, Maggie?
Yes, and knowing that trend is going up, and that many people see ADUs as like, gentle infill development that isn't disrupting the existing culture and fabric of the neighborhood. My question is like thinking, why aren't more ADUs being built? And some of what we're understanding, which like you all have tapped into by creating these sessions, is like, it's not totally clear to homeowners. You know, not everybody knows what an ADU is or what the benefits are. It feels to me like it's a little bit, I'm learning so much. And one of the things, Naomi, that I love about this is how can we operationalize these sessions and make them available to everyone so that it's not just coming through, Councilwoman Sandoval and your team, but that it's coming from the city. And it's helping more and more people who don't have the time who aren't experts in this, and quite frankly, probably don't have the time and capacity to go through all of these steps, maybe be a couple of, I don't know, $1,000 in, and then get like a soil sample result back that, oh no, this isn't going to work. So just curious, like, what you all are doing seems to really be helping to move the needle forward for more people to understand what ADUs are and how to go through the process. And I just want to know how we can scale this so that more people can have an opportunity to know what the potential pitfalls are and all of the things that they may come up against in building an ADU, and maybe how we can support them, in overcoming some of those barriers.
Yeah, thank you. Josh, I'm going to turn the question of why aren't there more ADUs being built over to you. And I will also give a shout out to our next ADUs in Denver meeting, which is going to be all about issues. And we'll dive into this, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Yeah, good points, Maggie. I mean, the education piece is a big one. A lot of folks just are not fully aware of what's possible and the necessary steps. But even when they are, it's some of these barriers that we're trying to tackle in this project. And so the ADUs, in theory, they sound great, but zoning really does kind of up the cost in a lot of ways and forces folks into maybe a bigger unit than they were expecting, or much more expense than they were expecting. We've only seen about 400 ADUs permitted since we re-legalized them citywide, which was in 2010. So not a huge boon in ADU development. And so yeah, we're also internally asking ourselves, what can we do to see more of them? We'd love to see more of this gentle density. And so yeah, we're looking really closely at how can we get zoning out of the way? How can we remove those barriers? I think the average cost of an ADU is coming in around $300,000 these days, which is not great, not wonderful. I mean, unfortunately, it is comparable to, I guess, an affordable housing unit at this point, because the cost of land is so high. And so it's, technically almost impossible to find housing for under $300,000, but we would love to, bring that down in whatever ways we can. And so we have the advisory committee assembled. We've got lots of architects, ADU builders, nonprofits, Habitat for Humanity, and things like that. And so we're all collaborating and doing what we can through this advisory committee to remove those barriers.
Awesome, thanks. All right, so next question, we're gonna go back into some details about these standards. And I might start showing my screen again because we have a bunch of questions about the 1.5 stories requirement, which again is something that the ADUs in Denver project is definitely looking into, because it may be incentivizing some weird forms by sort of forcing people to maybe, build a bigger base to a structure than they needed. Again, keep tuned to the ADUs in Denver project, because it may be that at the end of this year or early next year, we'll have some different rules, and we'll do another one of these meetings, absolutely, to share what they are. So Alfonso, you asked, explain more about the height requirements not exceeding 1.5 stories. So I can start a little bit on this, and then feel free to, you can unmute yourself if you want to describe a little bit more what you're wondering about, but I'm guessing maybe sort of the confusion of like, well, there's a height limit in feet. There's also a height limit in stories. Like, what's the difference? Or do you want to?
Well, we have an existing garage and we're looking at building above that. And does that mean that we only can build a half story up, or what does that mean? because it's already a large intact garage, and I believe the foundation is supported because it's, I think, a 3-foot foundation. It's a rather thick foundation.
Nice. Yeah, so I'll start on that, and Josh, chime in if you want at any point. So I think your case brings up a couple of really interesting points. One, reusing existing structures, which, as Josh mentioned, is something the ADUs in Denver project is going to try to make more feasible. There's a lot of things that get in the way of doing that. I'd say the biggest one is not so much like if you have your garage has a really solid foundation. I've encountered some other people too whose garages were like completely over-engineered in a good way, that like they're like, yeah, this actually does meet the building requirements or the building codes for a dwelling unit. So the foundation is good, but it could be that the placement of your existing garage on your property isn't, if it's not those 5 feet setback, that can often be what kind of catches people up, because you can't have any of that structure within those 5-foot setbacks. But let's forget that. Let's say, as you were asking about the height, how much, like if best case scenario, you can totally reuse this foundation, you just want to build up. You should be able to build up to, again, a maximum height of 24 feet. That 24 feet, that's really what we're talking about with like the actual height cap. The half-story thing is more of a footprint of the second story compared to the footprint of the bottom story. It's really not actually a height measurement, which is why it's so confusing. So your second story, you can certainly build a second story on it. It just has to be 75% or less of the square footage of that story below it. So if your garage is 100 square feet, you could only build 75 square feet on top of it.
Okay, we kind of get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, feel free, if you want more clarification, feel free to ask more questions. I know
It's tricky. Yeah, there's a lot of nuance in there. And you're also limited to the square footage of your ADU use allowance. So if you're only allowed 864 square feet, that's all you can build.
We have a 2.5. We have a 2.5 lot property. So.
Oh, nice. You should, yeah. So you should probably be able to build 1,000 square foot ADU use. And yes, that can be the use, the part of this, because it's another part of the weirdness is like you've got this idea of a structure, the ADU structure, but then an ADU structure doesn't have to be used as a dwelling unit. Like a portion of it can and has these restrictions on it, but the bottom could be the garage. And this actually goes to a question we got on Facebook as well. You can distribute the use so that the parts of the building that are actually the dwelling unit, you could have a little foyer on the bottom floor and then a stair that goes up and then the main actual living area is on the second floor. The entire structure itself is considered in that accessory dwelling unit form, but you could have most of the ground floor be a garage. And that's actually super, super common. I'd say that's what most ADUs I've seen do, is that they have a garage on the ground floor and then they have just honestly an entryway, stairs up to the living area on top.
Okay. There was one other question I do have.
Yeah.
Unpermitted buildings, because I know there was an old shed that they built that is on the property. Do I have to get a permit for that?
Probably. Yeah. There are, gosh, I don't want to misspeak. I think there are certain criteria for little structures like the tiniest little storage shed that doesn't need
A large storage shed. They moved the old garage and then they built the regular garage.
Yeah. It would be best to look into that and tackle that, because it will probably be, because someone's going to come out, because again, ADUs, because they're meant to be real dwelling units, they're pretty highly regulated in terms of like, you're going to get inspectors, you're going to get people coming out to make sure that everything's being built up to code. And so they're going to do a review of the property. And if they come out and they're like, oh, there's no building records for that shed, they're going to ask you to kind of retroactively get those permits.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do we have to go through inspection with those permits?
Permits for the
the old structures.
I'm not 100% sure, because like how could they, if they needed to look at the wall material
Yeah, raw
It's like, how would we
material,
do that?
that kind of a thing, yeah. I'm just-
Josh, do you have any idea?
Yeah, I think they'll come out and just inspect that it's just not a hazardous structure that's not going to fall down and,
Okay.
kill someone. So yeah, it's more of a life and safety thing. I don't think it's not like a design review per se, but it's just making sure that it's safe and secure. And I'm not sure about their fee structure, but it's pretty minor for tough sheds, things like that. So
Yeah,
Okay.
it isn't a huge deal. I would say the worst case scenario that I've come across is that someone actually had a garage, like foundation poured, like super solid permanent foundation garage built by a previous owner that was not permitted, and that was a bigger pain to try to
Yeah.
get it.
Well, the
But I
house
don't
was
know.
originally built in the early 1900s, and then they built around. I'm not even sure if they got even permits for that.
Oh, yeah. And it's so tricky because I mean, we live in very old parts of the city and there's exactly that case. I mean, there's been work done for 100 years or more. So, I don't think it's like literally every single tiny thing will be caught and you're like, oh, now your whole property has to be brought up to code and it's this giant disaster. I haven't seen that, but it is really particularly structures, things that are very obviously done or obviously like hazardous, like Josh was saying, inspectors will see like, is this structure or these other random structures on your property built out of actual building materials? That's a huge thing. You can't use sort of scrap stuff to
Yeah. No.
construct things. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Maggie, you asked, and we've only got a couple minutes left. Can you point to the part of the code?
I think we're good. You've allayed my concerns around some of this. But I do think that this is like another barrier that folks would
It is, yeah.
might keep them from. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I will mention that there's a program in the city. It's a partnership between the agency called HOST, which is the Housing Stability, Office of Housing Stability, and Habitat for Humanity. It's called the West Denver Renaissance Collaborative. They unfortunately are not active in any part of District 1 except Chaffee Park, but they are a program that started down in some of the neighborhoods of West Denver to provide financial assistance and support for people wanting to build an ADU who income qualify. And actually the income qualifications are pretty like high, like median income wise. But yeah, it's a really great program. And they work with Habitat for Humanity to have designed sort of these pre-designed ADUs. They're not pre-approved. They still all have to be, go through inspection, but it's a really cool program. But a lot of the, what I was going to say is that a lot of sort of the pain points that we've learned about building ADUs, especially trying to build them very affordably, have come from lessons learned from that organization. West Denver Renaissance Collaborative Single Family Home Plus program. They're awesome, really, really cool program. We would love to see them get even more funding and expand further throughout the city, because again, they provide kind of a complete hand-holding and walking through the ADU process, which is, you found out, is very daunting. All right, we're at 12:30. Any last burning questions from people? And nothing on Facebook. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. This was a great session. Huge thanks to Josh for his knowledge and his leadership on the ADUs in Denver project. Please go visit their website and sign up for updates. It's a really cool project. I'm really honored to be participating in it. And feel free, I'm going to put my email address, naomi.grunditz@denvergov.org, in the chat. You can always reach out to me with questions. If I don't know what the answer is, I'll find you the person that does. And I will be sending out these slides as a PDF to everyone who signed up and registered for this meeting. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.
yeah, thanks all.